Bhushan is offline, right? Bhushan?
Oh,
Bhushan?
where's Bhushan? Okay, so here's the story. This is what I'm going to show. Hemant asked me for an end-to-end training session with regard to frameworks. Now, in order to do end-to-end, I think it's not one session. I think it's 3 sessions. Lakshmi, mute yourself, please. So I think this is 3 sessions because there are certain issues surrounding access that are different than managers and different than engineering. So, Ashok, you might know some of this stuff, or you might have, you might not, you might have misconceptions. This I'm going to start with is access. So what I've enhanced today is the training domain. So let me show you the training domain. Now, here's a perfect example of when developers do things that are non-standard. Oh, I need to show my screen, don't I? That's why somebody is telling me, okay, show my screen. Okay, I'm just going to restart that recording. Today's lesson is going to be on access services. Before I start that, I'll tell you about my preparation this morning. A number of months ago, somebody created a training service, but did not create the domain properly, did not create a static diagram, basically went off and did things that are non-standard. So I want to first say this to everybody that is listening. You can do nothing that's non-standard. We don't have any code that's non-standard. If you can't find a standard way to do things, do not make it up. The chances are we already have a pattern to do it. You may not create your own patterns. Let me say that 1,000 times. You may not create your own patterns to do anything. What you can do is you can ask somebody what the pattern should be. And if there is not a pattern that fits your needs, what you will do is you will create a pattern and you will present it. And we will vet that pattern to the development community, just like it was open source. And we will either approve it or not approve it. But one thing you cannot do, and I need to emphasize this, you cannot go off and create your own style of code or your own pattern that you saw in a book or on MSDN or in any place else. Okay, that said, because somebody created this stuff without standard patterns, it cost me about 4 hours of work this morning. Now, if you think about that and you multiply that by millions of lines of code, that's the way you fall into a big mess, just like most of the people in the industry. We do not let that happen here. Off my soapbox about that. What you're looking at is a training domain. Let me go into the folder structure to show you. C:engineering, and we're going to go into source, HSP NextGen, and each one of these directories are what we call a domain. Keep in mind that's not domain-driven design. We are not on that train. These are domains, as we call them. And we have a training domain, and in this training domain, we have 2 projects. One's a car access, and one's a model. I should say 2 solutions. One is car access, and one is models. The models solution will always be there in every single domain. Okay, this is a static diagram, and as we can see, we have 5 services planned. And of these 5 services, the one that we are starting with is the access service. The reason why we're starting with the access service is because if I were to show you the dependency of this domain, you would see that the crash predictor engine, I will name that correctly, the crash predictor engine relies on car access, as well as the car manager. Okay. So the way I would create the car access solution is I would right click and I would say create solution. I've already done that, and I am in fact in the hsp.training.car access solution now. Please take note of the solution name. Our standard is the company name, or the company name is now Radius. The company name used to be High Street Partners. It was purchased by Radius. We have kept that as our first three letters of all of our projects. HSP dot domain, which is training, dot car access, which is the name of this service. Okay. In detailed design, I have already created a car access model. The car access model has 4 simple operations, and each operation has a request and a response, which is very standard. So if I would look at persist car, I could see that the input data contract is persist car request, and the output data contract is persist car response. Request and response objects are the only objects that are allowed into or out of an operation. You may not use int, string, or anything else. They must be request and they must be response. The reason for this is because if you want to add to the request, let's say you want to add an ID or a name or any other properties, you could do so without breaking other services. Okay. The model itself is very standard where things are placed. On the left-hand side, we have the service, and we have the service configuration. Then we have enums, of which I will discuss later. There is one enum for each request, and they will hold validation enums. Then we have the request objects, followed by data contract aliases and only data contract aliases. The only thing that can go in between the request and the response is an alias. Another data contract cannot go in there. It would not be correct to put a data contract here and then put some link. We do not do that. Please do not do that. It would be correct to take this and create an alias and set this alias to DC1, and now we have an alias, and that alias can be used as needed. In fact, we could have as many aliases as we want to have of the same type. And what good is an alias? An alias is good because we don't have to mess up our models. They allow us to keep our models clean and organized. If you do not keep your model clean and organized and standard, then there will be a problem. If I go into a model and it's not standard, it's the equivalent of coming over my house, taking a dish of spaghetti and throwing it on the wall. Please don't do that. I don't like spaghetti on my wall. Why are we so freakish about the placement of our models and the artifacts, the boxes that the models contain? Because we have hundreds and hundreds of them. And in order for us to scale our models, they all have to be precise and clean and organized. When a developer goes into this model, they should not have to spend 2 seconds, and I mean that. That is not virtual, it is literal. 2 seconds. I want to know where to go to get at anything I need to get at without even looking. If not, I'm wasting my time. Okay. Please note that you won't even see this. Why won't you see that? That's a mess. The number of pixels between these are different, and that makes it unorganized. Look at this. The car request and the car response, get car list and get car response, is not aligned. They need to be aligned in order for it to be organized. Okay. I'll get off of that soapbox. So, if I were to zoom out on this model, and if you don't have this drop down and these icons in your Visual Studio, you can right click on the tool I guess it's the toolbar, and click on DSL Designer, and then you can minimize the model or demagnify the model or whatever you want to do. I think you can also do it if you have a mouse wheel. Our standard is that we have the service and config, and then we have the enums, we have the requests and the response with the aliases in between. We have the DC configuration and the entity configuration and DB configuration right next to the entity configuration. It would be better, and I'm going to change this now, if I have more than one database that I need to talk to in an access service, then I would name this training config, and I would name this training DB config. Because I might end up with more databases and more configs, and I need to be more specific about my names. Great. It is the job of a resource access service, or we call it for short access service, to communicate to some data store. It is the only type of service, other than in occasionally utilities, that are allowed to speak to data storage facilities, such as a SQL database. I'm going to concentrate on one operation, and that operation is going to be the get car operation. When you save the model, the standard 4 solutions will be created for this project. Now, I'm not treating this as a first training session of frameworks, because you have probably already seen something. Somebody just, yeah, okay, thank you. Somebody just went off mute. So I'm treating this as though you've seen
Hi,
frameworks
John.
already.
Hi,
Hi,
John. This
come on. I lost you. Okay, you're in and out, so I'll continue.
I joined late. I was into another meeting.
No problem. I've explained what I'm going to do. This is going to be 3 sessions to get us end to end. The first one is access. The second one is going to be about managers, and the third one is going to be about engines. And that should take us closer to an end to end. Okay, that said, I'm going to concentrate on the get car operation. The get car operation's responsibility is to take in some ID and return a car. Let's look at the database. Now, we have 3 entities that we're using of the training database. It does not mean that those are the only tables in the training database. In fact, I want to define entity. Entity loosely translates into a table. If we are talking about SQL or Azure table storage or some similar type of database storage mechanism. And I say loosely transferred or loosely disguised, if you will, because a car, within the car table in the database, this may be just a subset of the columns that are needed, columns that are in the car. If I have 32 columns and all I need to do is read a car and all I need is these 7 or 8 columns, then that's all I'm going to put on my entity. I do not need to take down that other information, nor do I need to complicate my model. One note, if you're showing only a subset of columns and you need to insert a new car, then all of the other columns in the database need to be nullable. If they're not, if they require data, then your insert statement is going to bomb. The exception with that would be if you had a default on your column, in which case SQL will inject the proper default piece of data. Okay. So if I was tasked with creating this training database like it was a brand new database, what I would do is I would go into my engineering folder and find database, and then I would find training, and I would create these different folders. So I'm quickly going to explain it. So we have a tables folder. The tables folder defines the table. Let me get my notepad here. So it's just a simple data table creation statement, and it creates the car table. I want to point out a few things. Where possible, we use defaults, and I'll come back to that in a minute. I have created date here, and I have a default date, and created by, and I have a default user. Okay. Let's go to foreign keys, simple foreign key information. This car references car type, etc. Seed data. Seed data is defined as data that is always needed whenever a new database is created. So, if we were to look at that, we could see that there are car types. What I do not like about this at all, this is extraneous data. There's no reason to put DBO. It just will muck it up. And if you would look at this version and they're all set to 0, well, first of all, version IDs, underbar version. Let me explain what it is. It's a way to promote optimistic concurrency in a optimistic locking rather in a SQL database using NHibernate. So the version number, every time a car is inserted or updated, or in this case a car type is inserted or updated, NHibernate will increase the version number. And it does that because if you go to get a car type and the version is 2, and then when you try to save that car type, the version still must be 2. If it is 3, then somebody else has saved it in front of you, and you will get an NHibernate exception. So it promotes optimistic locking. If you don't know what that is, Google it. Okay. What I do not like about this is that this is really extraneous data. First of all, they're setting it to 0. It should be, if anything, it should be set to 1. But that should be default information. So if I would go into the table and I would go into the edit with Notepad, first of all, there's a bunch of junk in here. And, you know, if it's not needed, then don't put it in there. This is going to be a default of 1. And all of our SQL should be capitalized in varchar 255. Great. That looks clean now. Oh, I don't need my DBO statement. I don't know why it's there. So now that I have put in my default, I do not need my version numbers. And in case you don't know how to do this, and believe it or not, I didn't know how to do this till like last year. It's rather embarrassing to say. But if you hold down Alt and select, it will treat it as though it's a column and select the column. It's incredibly useful. So I'm just going to remove that. And then I'm going to take out my zeros because I no longer need them. This cleans up my data a bit. And we just can't be too clean about the way we do things. Okay, so that's my car type. Great. Now, what's more interesting about these tables, about this data, is when I have test data. So if I had to open that up, you see a file called hsp.training.car_access. This file is solely for the purpose of testing car access. If I had another access service which needs to utilize the training database, which is not unusual at all, I would create another file and I would name it the name of my service. So HSP training, some other service, .SQL. Why do we do that? Well, if we have two different access services, both accessing training, and somebody changes the data for the training.car access, that could break tests that somebody else has written on training.some other service. And that is a nightmare. So one service has one or more, but usually one one test data file. So let's look at that test data file. And here, this is easy enough. There is just one row that is being inserted into car. And that's whatever the developer wants to test. Great. So I might go ahead and I might create my data for training and my database for training if it hasn't been created already. The next thing I will want to do is will want to create the get car operation. And the get car operation, simple enough, and I urge you to study this. I'm recording it, so you should study it. I'm going to just quickly show you what the patterns are. I did this morning before the training session. I want to just take a look at something that I didn't do that Frameworks generated. So this is a Frameworks generated stub. It is there. It's the initial creation of this file. The code generator will not override your changes. So notice that this comment is far different than the comment we put in, say, a generated file where we have these markings. This says changes to this file may cause incorrect behavior and will be lost if the code is regenerated. So here, in a generated code, you do not change. It will be overridden. However, stubs, as we call them, is just an initial file that Frameworks will create for you that you will be allowed to change at your discretion. Okay. Let's go back to my get car that I wrote earlier. Frameworks puts these guys in. I've added a private variable called _car, and we're seeing that _car doesn't match the rules that we have set up for ReSharper, and that's because this VM, this Visual Studio, does not have the standard rules that we have created. The standard rules are in, see if I remember how to do this, manage options, import from file, and I believe it is in engineering, tools, ReSharper settings. Let me close it and see if what happens when I bring it back in. Does it still not like it? Still doesn't like it, which means those settings are out of date. So that's something that I'll have to fix offline. Okay. Along with this private property, I've imported 2 new properties, one that descends from car DAO and one that, not descends, one that is an iCar DAO and one that is a iCar map. By our convention, we always name our variables, our public variables, the same name as the interface without the I when possible. And even with the private variable, we have an entity car, so it's just simply named car. Great. In order to get this car, I'm going to work with my public method, get car. It's the only public method of the operation, and I call this public method the table of contents, and I do that because without looking at any other code, I can see what this operation will do. Simply assign a car and map the car. So let's look at assign car. It first checks every method we have. We'll check the validation results. Whether we set it or not, we just write that piece of code. It makes sense to do so. If the validation results is not valid, we just simply return. Otherwise, we utilize the car DAO to get by ID, and we send it the request car ID. Now, if I'm to look at this model, I can see that there's a car entity and then there's a data contract entity. The data contract is what is released out of this service. Entities are never exported out of the service, never. It could have information that is detrimental to other services that use an entity. Okay. It could have security information, for example. That's why we always separate it. Contracts are for public consumption, and entities are not. How do I then, if I go get an entity from a database, how do I then transfer it into a data contract? Well, it's pretty simple. Frameworks will create this thing called a car map, and a car map is a rather complex class, and the car map might talk to other classes in the map, and those classes might do something like set the entity ID to the data contract ID and vice versa. So if I were to go to my frameworks model once again, and I were to put in, say, a new property, something new, and put it here, something new, and save. Go back to my car map. I can see that something new was inserted by frameworks here. The file, rather, was regenerated and something new was put there. And in that fashion, the data contracts are very simple to map over. If something new was not here, then Frameworks is smart enough to know not to map it because it would be a compiler error. Okay. Using the car map is really simple. All I need to do is I need to import the car map and just say response.car is carmap.transfer. Notice that the transfer is overloaded so that it would know how to take in a data contract and return an entity. It would know how to take in a collection of entities and turn them into a collection of data contracts, or a collection of data contracts and return a collection of entities, and vice versa. Okay, so it's a really simple process. So I assign the car, then I map the car, and then I return the car. And you would be surprised to see that in business applications, This happens over and over and over again. It's more complex, but it happens over and over and over again. Data is requested, data is retrieved, data is mapped to a different format, and data is returned. I mean, that's the very basic of any any application that, especially applications that look like CRUD applications. And by I mean CRUD, create, update, and delete. By the way, the closer you get to pure CRUD, the less that frameworks really helps you. In fact, if you're doing CRUD applications, or in other words, data over forms, then you shouldn't even bother doing tiers and services. You should just use something like LightSwitch, which will just create the whole application very quickly. We don't do that. That's Mickey Mouse, and we're not a 2-layer architecture. And we have a lot more to do than just CRUD applications. However, sometimes our applications might appear to be CRUD, especially when you're doing really simple things like just get a car and you have a form that you enter information in and you want to retrieve it, update, delete it. Okay. I chose to use a CRUD application just because it's simple to show you some of the basic capabilities and how you should write patterns in our platform. Moving on. What if we wanted to add an entity, and that entity, let's say, was driver, and the driver had, let's say, an ID, and the ID is an integer, and it is a primary key, and it is an identity column in SQL Server. And I want to create queries. Clicking this will create queries so that you will have an automatic query in the data access object that you won't have to write. So let's put in a driver, and let's put in a name, and the name is string. Great, we don't have to touch it. And let's put in an age. Let's call that integer. Age would be kind of dumb, wouldn't it be? Let's put in birth date. Let's make this a date time. And let's put in a, let's see, name, birth date, and let's put in sex. And we will just make that a string. Okay. Couple properties I want to make you aware of. Frameworks maintain fields. These are fields that we do not show on the model because we want to keep the model clean. So if we want the created fields, that is created by and created and updated by, created by and created date, then we would set this to true. And if we want the updated fields, that is updated by and updated date, then we would set this to true. If we want the version field, and that is to promote optimistic locking, we would set this to true, and that is the default frameworks. So now let's go and create our file, our data definition language, our SQL file. Let's go to Notepad, and let's open up. I'm just going to steal this to make my life easier. I'm going to say new, and let's see, we don't need, this is going to be a driver, right? Int identity, name 255. We don't need this stuff, but we do need sex. So we'll say sex, and that's a, wait a minute, yep. Sex is char, and that's 1. And version and updated by and all that sounds good. Let's save this as a 00040, and that will be driver. I'll just say something briefly about the numbers here. The reason why these are numbered is because when frameworks or when our code will create the database, you might need to create the tables in a certain order or foreign keys in a certain order. And the order is taken from the number in the bracket. Usually you just look at the next one in line and you add 10, and that's all you'll need. So let's name this driver.sql and save. And let's just take a quick look at it. Driver ID, name, sex, and that all looks pretty good to me. Version default to 1. That looks pretty good. So whenever you run a test now, this driver table is going to be created. Let's now go back to our model here, and let's create a many-to-many relationship between car and driver. So this would be many. This would be many. And I don't care if I don't need that navigation property, and I'll put this down here. Notice how I avoid this. I try not to put 90 degrees in my lines if I can help it. And believe me, you can help it. Okay. If you don't like the way that looks, then what you could do is this. And this is like a big no-no. So I just expand this guy. That looks nice and neat now. Okay. So now we have a car can have many drivers, and a driver can drive many cars. Great. In order to do this, as you know, a many-to-many, we would need a many-to-many table. And in this case, it would be a car driver table. So let's just quickly create that, and file, new, and this would be car driver, and this would be car ID, and this would be a driver ID. You don't need that. Whoops, let's just do that a little bit more carefully. And then what's the primary key ID? I think it's car ID and comma driver ID. That might not be right, but we'll see if it's right when the first time we have to create the database. And I will save this, save as 50 car driver SQL. Great. Notice that we don't have a car driver table. We don't need it. Car driver entity. We don't need it. Both frameworks and in Hibernate understand the many-to-many relationship and will do the right thing. Okay. Let's go look at the ORM code that was created for car. So this ugly XML is what frameworks creates in order to map the objects to the relational database. and this is in Hibernate specific code. And we can see that there's a driver list here, and the table that it is expecting is car driver. Okay, looks good. You very rarely, if ever, have to go into that ORM code. So I think we're ready for a test. And the test we're going to write is an integration test. So I've already created one integration test for us. And in this case, what I'm doing here is I want to test the operation. And this is testing the operation is rare. Excuse me one moment, please. Drink of water. Testing an operation is rare. Most of the time, you will want to test the repositories and the factories and the other objects that the operation relies on. Normally, we do have one test for an operation just to make sure that it is calling what you think it should be calling. I'll explain more about that when we look at mocking. So in this case, the name of the test is getCar returns car. And it's an integration test, so we use IOC Manager to get the car operation. We give it a request, and then we're going to make sure that the validation results returns true, and that we have that we actually have a car, it's not null, and that the car ID is equal to 1. Validation results, what's that? If you look at our response objects, all our response objects have validation results. This is a special object. It is an object that we use to return validation results to the consumer, and typically every single response has a validation result. Okay, so let's try to run this. Now, when I run this, since it descends from test space, it is going to run some initialization on every single test. What's it going to do? It's going to drop the training database, and then it's going to create the training database. So we'll watch that happen, and we'll see if what I did was correct. I do not know if it is. The last thing before we run the test, whoops, I want to build this thing. So let's let that build so I can see the tests. And let's go to the Test Explorer. Whoops, Test Explorer. Now, this is a test class, and we have an initializer, and that's also a test class, and it has an assembly initialize, which means before the first test is run, this code will run, and we will initialize or reinitialize our environment, and then we will initialize the InHibernate profiler in case we want to profile the SQL coming out of InHibernate. That runs automatically. You don't have to do anything for that to run. So we're going to right-click here, and we're going to say Debug Tests. So it immediately goes into our test base, sets the database path to where that directory was. It's always in the same place. That's created by Frameworks, by the way. And we go into populate training, and we go get the SQL files, and we can inspect the SQL files, and These SQL files are a reflection what you looked at. Here's 0010 car SQL, and we could look at that car table. Okay, so goes to get those files, and then what it doesn't do is it doesn't add the test data automatically. You have to add that by specifying the name of the SQL file that we created for test data. Add that to the SQL file list, and then this statement will configure and populate the database and give us some results. We'll inspect the results to see how they are. It said 10 succeeded, 2 failed, 0 ignored. So I did in fact screw something up. So if I were to look at the field log, let's look at this. So driver SQL, an exception occurred while executing a SQL statement. There is already an object named PK_car. So I messed that up. Let's go and fix that. This is, let's see, driver SQL. This should be PK_driver. Okay, let's see the next mess up. An exception occurred. The definition for column ID must include a data type. So this is on car driver. So let's go see that car driver. And in fact, I messed that up. Int. And I can already tell you that that's wrong, so I'm going to change that. Save it. And let's go back. And I think that was it. So I'm just going to try to do it again. Cheat a little bit. See what I get. 2 failed. I'm going to stop that, and I'm going to just run it. Let's see what I get. Get car. Which one was I running? The top one? Nope. I was running this one. Okay. So let's see if we did this right. And what happened here? Do I have decent results? So 1 failed. Let's try and see what we can get here. The car driver through an exception. Car ID, driver ID does not exist in the tag table. All right, so I messed that up. So what I would typically do when I keep messing it up, I will just take it. I will throw it into my SSMS. I'll run it. Car ID, driver ID doesn't exist. So I think what that means is that I should have done this. Okay, let's run that, see if it worked. It did. So I'll take that and I'll put it back in my notepad. And I'll save it. And let's go back to Visual Studio and car access. I'm going to try to cheat again and see if what I come up with here. What did it do? It still failed. Okay. Sometimes that works. I haven't spent enough time to figure out when and why you can do that. I think it has something to do with caching the information. Debug again. And let's go down to here and see what we got for results. And I can see that 12 succeeded on field, so that looks pretty good. If I ever wanted to see the whole SQL, oh no, that's not the whole SQL. If I want to see the whole SQL, then I think it's buried somewhere in results. Yeah, all successful combined, all scripts combined. So this is everything that script does, even the things that you didn't do, like drop the database and run create database, and then go through all the files that we created. Okay. So let's continue. So that's going to do that. That's fine. That's fine. Now let's look at the operation. We go into the operation. We set the request and the response. We assign the car. Oh, and we get a problem. So let's go fix the problem. Let's see what the problem says. So it's giving this big yucky statement, right? Invalid column name, something new. By the way, sometimes I just do this and I take this into SSMS and I'll just run the SQL part in SSMS, and that will help me figure out what's going on, separate all the crap out, and then just run it. You know, P1 is 1, so I'm going to set here 1, and then, you know, there's my statement. So sometimes I do that. So let's go back here and fix up our model, because I was just suggesting, I was demoing the mapped features. Whoops. Something new. Let's take that away. Save. And go to our Test Explorer. Debug tests. Try this again. I don't need these breakpoints anymore. Thank you. Let's go see what this guy does. Assign the car. Go get it. Got it successfully that time. Transfers the car over to a data contract. Returns the data contract. I'm out of the operation. And it should be valid. It should be not null. And it should be a car. And the test worked. Okay. That was 1 hour. I want 2 things from you guys. I want to know if you have any questions, and then I need to know whether this session on access services was at the right level. Did I go too deep? Did I go not deep enough? You know, access services is where we put a lot of work in. So why don't we open up the floor to anything that anybody wants to say? Take yourself off mute, too.
Yeah, it's good.
You think
Actually,
that was
it's a great session.
okay?
Yeah, sure. Actually, the way you are testing the operation using IOC Manager, we are doing the same, but in the first line, IOC Manager dot resolve is there. Right? There we are getting one issue. No export type found for the operation. We are getting that error.
Okay, so I'll take that offline, but the reason why you're probably getting that is there's something wrong with I don't know why. I have to look at the code. We'll after this, when we get done with this, we'll look at the code, okay?
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
Anything else from anybody? Okay. Hey, Mon.
John,
Yes, go ahead.
I had a query regarding the redactions because I had implemented something on a manager when it comes to the access service. Redactions, we can still use MVF for injecting the dependencies, right? Within redactions.
Yeah, sure. Yep.
Okay. And how about if we have to work with any claims here?
Yeah, so normally we don't do authorizations at the access level. We will normally authorize at the manager level. And the reason for that is we work on a trusted subsystem pattern. So If the manager trusts the authentication of the user, then the service underneath it trusts it as well. And that's why our managers normally do the authorization code. Now, as far as redaction goes, that often is done at the access level. And I think that redactions are probably a bit more advanced concept, and I think we should probably have a training session on both authorizations and redactions. But we would do the redactions here in the access service.
Okay, so in the case of doing redactions in the access layer, John, we would be doing the redaction based upon a user's authority or the permission.
Yes, correct.
Would that be the case? Yeah. So if that's the case, then the ideal location should be the manager, where we should be doing all the redactions.
No, I think access redactions belong at the access level, not the manager level. Yeah. Because
Okay.
it's the access that's truly going to know, what data it is getting. And the managers have a different view of the data. So you want to do redactions early, and that would mean at the access level.
Okay. Okay.
Okay? Okay. Herman, so Bhushan, go ahead. Yeah, you have a question. Go ahead, Bhushan.
Yeah. I'm not having a question, but two observations on the code that like in the coding standards, it was given that you should not use a private property, right? Rather use a variable.
Did I use
Hello?
a private property?
Yeah.
Oh, yuck. Thank you. Bhushan, you just earned your salary for the week. No, I'm kidding. Yeah, there would be no reason. There would be no reason to tell the compiler to go and create the getters and setters there. Thank you.
Yeah,
Oh, and
and
that's,
this like
Bhushan, that is why my that is why ReSharper was throwing up, because it didn't like the naming convention for a private variable, and that's because I don't have one, and it should not be, and now ReSharper likes it. Bhushan, a genius you are, a genius. Okay.
yeah, and the second thing was like in the mapka method.
Down here. Go ahead.
Valid or not, and yeah, in the mapka method, and we are directly passing the car object like whether it is assigned or not. So we are not checking whether the car we have, or the ID what we have passed, we have got the car object or not.
Well, the thing is, okay, that's actually another very good question. One could do this, right? One could say, if I wanted to validate, it depends on the requirement. If I wanted to validate the fact that we needed a car, and if we didn't have a car, I could say if underscore car equals null, then response dot validation results dot add result, car not found, comma, whatever with this enum is here. Get car enum. Oh, I need to save it so it creates the code. Yes. Get car enum dot car not found. And then this statement would not run because it would be invalid at that point. But there are much better ways to do validations. That would be a kind of an odd way of doing it. We'll dig into validations in another session more. But that's a really good question.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good. I have to go, but first, Hemant, I've thought about the right level, and I think to get to an end-to-end, we need to go through each service, at least to some degree, and then bubble all the way up to the manager.
Sure. I guess like this session was really, really great, Trajan, and I guess most of the people are very clear with what would be the expectation from data access service as such, and yeah, you're right. Probably we can go for each, engine and manage it separately,
Right.
and then probably if required we can have another sessions.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's probably another session called Advanced Access Services or something that really dig into validations and redactions. And repositories. We'll cover that in another session, but I think this is a good opening session for access services. And with that, I thank you, and I have another meeting to go to. So everybody have a good night.
Thank you, John. Thank you very